Hello, welcome everybody to our second session. We're having people come in now, and it looks like we're up to 900 and past 900. Um, this means that we will have a YouTube live link posted on the Urge Twitter page as well as on the website once we get to over 1,000. Today, we're going to have Phoebe Cohen be the host. And Phoebe, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Vishan. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first Urge interview. And we hope that the first week of reading has been interesting and productive for all of you. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Drs. Vernon Morris and Matthew Clare. Dr. Morris joined Arizona State University as a professor of chemistry and environmental sciences and director of the School of Mathematical and Natural Sciences at the New College of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences in July 2020. And previous to coming to ASU, Dr. Morris was a professor of chemistry and atmospheric sciences at Howard University, where he did some really amazing work in atmospheric sciences and in diversifying the academy. We're also joined by Matthew Clare, who's the author of this week's reading, and he is an assistant professor of sociology at Stanford University. If you've read his paper, then you're already familiar with some of the things that Dr. Clare thinks about, but more broadly, he thinks about the intersections of law and society, race and ethnicity, social inequality, cultural sociology, criminal justice, and the use of qualitative methods. And we're really thrilled to have them both with us today. A reminder, the session is being recorded, and if you have questions, you can use the Zoom question function to ask them. And so to start, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Morris, who's going to share with us some of his thoughts on the importance of leadership, the roles that departments can play in anti-racist work, and some of his own observations about what does and doesn't work in these spaces.
Thank you. And I apologize for any heartburn that I've caused so far today. So a little bit more about how I got here. It's been about 20 years at Howard University, which is an HBCU in Washington, DC, at various levels of faculty and administration, and I've now come to Arizona State as director of the school. And so I think some of the challenges that majority institutions face are actually shared to a large extent, if not magnified, at smaller institutions and HBCUs and minority serving institutions. So what I'm going to say, I think, carries across in ways that to some may be surprising, but I think if you've been in the administration of HBCUs and have seen some of the administrative gymnastics at majority serving institutions, they're quite similar in some of the struggles to diversify faculty, to make the academy an inclusive place, to accelerate and support the success of BIPOC and in particular African-American faculty in the geosciences and really in STEM. So thanks, Phoebe, for those questions. Louder? Let me see, I can try to turn myself up too, if that helps. Is that better? Is that a little bit louder? Or I can talk louder, I think, too, if that helps. Okay, I get some nods. So the first question, how can the privileged, the academic leadership serve as better institutional allies to BIPOC plus students and faculty? And how, the importance of taking a stand. I think one of the first things that has to be taken to heart is that these are systemic problems. And so what you do as an individual is important, and there should be leadership from an individual perspective, but you have to go in understanding that there probably are going to have to be systemic changes in practice, changes in policy that have to reverberate beyond your unit. You have to be prepared to try to make impact beyond your unit and certainly beyond the individual. So that means an assessment of the culture of the unit that you're in, how that relates to the larger culture, and what you can do specifically to try to change that. And sometimes those changes mean that you're going to need to connect with the board of trustees to have the right type of pressure, that you might have to connect with the provost and the president, the folks who are making policy level changes that are institutional in nature. And I've had the fortune and misfortune of being able to do that at various institutions. But I think that's important. You've got to, I think, understand that the road to equity in the academy is fraught with as many barriers and dangers and resistance as a road to equity in the broader community, that there's far more failures than there are going to be successes, and that each success is going to be almost be immediately challenged and pushed back against. And I think if you don't go in with that mindset, that a win is a win, and we're going to build from that next year, we're going to build from that in the next 5 years, that just has never been the case. And I think, in my experience in environmental justice, when you think you're about to get that win, or you just blocked, just got an injunction, almost immediately there's a full force effort to remove that and push it back a ways. And I think those waves of resistance to change in the academy, from my perspective, are even stronger than some of the waves against social equity in the larger community. And then I think finally, and I'm borrowing some of the language from Matthew's paper, Matthew's publication, which I enjoyed reading, solutions require a pluralism of strategies, right? So it's not just one approach or one modality that you try to make these changes. And I'm going to give some specific examples, but you need to multiplex it. And it's not an issue of, okay, we're going to do this thing first, and then when that's done, we're going to do this other thing. That, again, is not going to work, because as soon as you take your attention off that 1A, it's going to get pushed back as you try to bring that B step up. You've got to do things in multiplex and pluralist sort of approach. So that was first point. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. You've got to convince your colleagues and your peers and your leadership that sometimes the systems that they've grown comfortable with and can't recognize anything is wrong with are broken. It's not about tweaks. System could actually be broken, and you're just comfortable with the way it operates right now. And that's another long-standing effort. You got to amplify BIPOC, diverse voices, but not without a clear directive for action. One of the things that I see going on a lot of places is, I'm going to get this advisory committee. I'm going to have a listening circle. I'm going to do this. And people voice their opinions, and they feel empowered by the fact that they are being heard. And then there's no action on the back end. There's no plan for action even on the front end. And I think those things, again, that's why I talk about multiplexing. You've got to be developing the plans to enact change as you bring in these voices, as you amplify more voices. So I think it's good to have advisory groups. They need resources assigned to them. It cannot be an advisory group with no resource. There has to be an accountability structure. That is 360s for your top administrators, unit level assessments that have points specifically assigned, DEI plans that have action accountability, not just a plan, but what does it take to enact that plan, where the resources there, and then what happens as you miss or make milestones in that plan. And then you've got to coordinate efforts across units. And this is what I mean. One of the things going on at Arizona State right now is that there's 25 has grown to 29 initiatives. And you've got a number of schools and departments generating JEDI plans. If they're not coordinated, if they're not using similar rubrics, how do you assess that you're making progress institutionally? It's very difficult, if not impossible. And so you, again, have to coordinate these plans, which means you've got to resource someone at the presidential or VP level who's responsible for making these things move forward. All right, so making all of this. How much time do I have? I'm just going to take a couple minutes left.
Yeah, you've got 4 more minutes.
4 more minutes is good. I can do that in 4. I think we've got to adopt some new models of mentoring. A lot of times what we try to do is coach people through the broken system. All right, here's how you walk along these coals, these burning hot coals. You take a deep breath, or instead of saying, okay, here's how you bring your best self and value who you are as you come through the system, and here's how we're going to work together to change the system. Here's where the pressure points are in the system. And instead of just saying, the system's not going to change, so deal with it, you have to try to get people to recognize where the barriers are, and at the same time try to remove those barriers, so that there are feedback loops in that mentorship or that coaching, mentoring relationship, where if there are barriers that I can't see as I coach or help or assist, inform me so that I can now go back to the system as a leader and say, look, these are the things that we have to change. A couple of ideas in my last 2 minutes. One, I think hiring BIPOC faculty has to be part of the solution. It just is, and not just at the junior level. There's got to be targeted opportunity hires where you bring in representation at the VP level, at the dean levels, at the provost levels, all along, so that you can get this coordination of people who want to amplify these voices in these programs. You can develop accountability by having double-blind reviews of diversity statements. Require diversity statements for absolutely every position. There needs to be a rubric for that. And instead of having faculty who've never looked at a diversity statement make those evaluations on, Happy Talk, you can actually have Black students do blind reviews of those. Require specificity, right? Require points on that. And there are some very nice rubrics that are out there. You got to make changes to the P&T process. Again, I think there are schools of public policy that already have models that can be used in STEM and in geosciences on how to value public-facing work, community action, even if it's internal-facing community action. I think hopefully there'll be a lot of rich questions where we can come back to these things, but I do think that an enforcement of a difference in mentoring models changing to critical mentoring, where it's more nuanced, a more nuanced approach to assisting with the success of BIPOC plus faculty. So thanks.
Thank you. That was really awesome. And we really appreciate the specific ideas and suggestions you had, since URGE is really about, action, changing policy, not just learning, which is important, but that's not enough, right? So thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to turn it over now to Dr. Claire. Who's going to talk a little bit more about the words and the language that we use in these conversations and how important it is to have common ground on what we mean when we talk about racism.
So thanks for the introduction. Thanks to Dr. Morris also for being sort of a co-panelist with me. I'm excited to engage with you and learning a lot from you. I am a junior faculty member, so I'm learning a lot about how change works within the academy. I also, before I begin, just want to acknowledge the loss of life that brought us here today. I see there are more than 1,000 participants. And, the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, so many other Black people, Indigenous people by police that has galvanized a movement has really sort of been the impetus that has made many of these conversations across institutional spaces happen. And I just want to acknowledge that. So you read one of my articles on racism. I believe you read the one that I wrote with my co-author when I was a graduate student. And at that time, this was before the election of Donald Trump and the election across Western countries of white nationalist, sympathetic if not themselves, politicians and political leaders. So in many ways, some of what we were discussing, such as the decline in overt racism, we see it has actually reemerged in many ways since we wrote that article. But I'm just going to start by just sort of giving you definitions of key terms that I hope will guide your analysis today and throughout the rest of the sessions with URGE. So first, how should we think about racism without first defining race? So race is defined as a social construct used to differentiate people into groups on the basis of immutable or phenotypical characteristics, such as one's skin color, the shape of one's eyes, their hair texture. And these phenotypic markers have no genetic relationship to differences in behavior or intelligence or things that we think matter in social life. However, a classification system has emerged during European colonization, the slave trade, the spread of capitalism throughout the West, that has made these categories or has imbued them with social significance and also has hierarchized them. So race becomes racism, and race is really defined and rooted in the existence of racism because the classification scheme was developed in many ways in order to justify and also reproduce forms of domination and exploitation of groups that were racialized. So racism can be defined as an ideology of racial inferiority that generates or reproduces racial domination and exploitation. And this happens at various levels. So I'll get there in a minute. But before doing that, I want to mention white supremacy, which is another term that is often used when people talk about racism. So white supremacy is the specific form of racism that is dominant in the United States and many Western countries and really globally today. White supremacy means that racism in its form places white people at the top of the racial ordering or hierarchy, therefore reproducing domination and exploitation systemically in favor of people who are racialized as white. And I intentionally say racialized as white because the category of whiteness has expanded and contracted across time and does so even for people as they move across borders. Now, racial discrimination, as many social scientists define it, is really the behavioral act. So we could think of racism as containing an ideology, which is in our heads, and then a behavioral action or actions, which would be using that ideology to treat people unequally. And so that's how we get to racial discrimination, which is defined as the unequal treatment of individuals on the basis of their racial group membership. So often we assume, and we have measured this as social scientists, that there tends to be a tight connection between racism as an ideology and then behavioral forms of racism. So a person who may hold prejudiced attitudes or antipathy against one group will be more likely than a person who doesn't hold that to discriminate in various ways in interpersonal interactions, in the employment and hiring context, in the criminal legal system, which I study, than people who do not hold those individual level beliefs. Racial discrimination, though, is not always negative. So it can have positive or pro-social aspects to it. So for example, we can think of affirmative action as a positive form of discrimination that is rooted in equity. So Dr. Morris mentioned equity. So this is distinct from negative forms of racial discrimination because here we have a sense of giving more to groups who are in need or who have been historically or contemporarily marginalized in order to equalize a playing field. And then I think it's important to differentiate the levels, as I mentioned, of racism. So Dr. Morris talked about structural changes as being really important, and that's because much of racism operates at the structural level, even when individuals are well-intentioned or unaware of biases that they may have. So one level that racism operates is the individual level. This is the most common way that people think about racism in the public mind, and also how scholars used to historically study racism. They used to tend to just study it at the individual level, especially in the middle of the 20th century. So individual level racism is personal prejudice that favors one group over another. And we can think of several forms of individual racism. We can think of blatant or overt racism. So this is intentional and it's explicit. This is the type of racism where someone says to you, I believe that other groups are inferior than my group. And it could be based on biological beliefs or based on cultural beliefs. So it could be that there's a sense that one group is less than another group because they're biologically inferior, or it could be that the person believes that they are culturally inferior, meaning that they have sort of cultural ways or values that are just unacceptable in that person's mind, and therefore justifies their lower status on a hierarchy. Covert racism is slightly different. Covert racism is also intentional, but it's not made explicit. So this is where someone may actually believe that some groups are inferior to others, but they are not going to explicitly tell you that. They're not going to tell a survey methodologist that. They're not going to tell their family or friends that even, and certainly not their coworkers. Implicit bias is where there's no intention at the individual level, but perhaps there is, and this can be measured, of course, through the implicit association test, there is an unconscious association between good, warm feelings for one group over another that they may have negative feelings toward. The next level of analysis, and there are sort of three main ones. The second level of analysis is institutional. So this is institutional racism, was sort of defined really in the 60s and then has been sort of specified in various ways. But typically, this is where organizational systems and practices systematically favor one group over another in an unjust way. So a classic example from what I study is sort of the crack cocaine sentencing disparity. This disparity still exists, although it was reduced during the Obama administration. But basically, this is the idea that on its face, this practice is an organizational or institutional practice within the legal system that is technically race neutral, but in practice, it disadvantages Black drug users in comparison to white drug users, because Black drug users are more likely on average to use crack cocaine rather than powder cocaine compared to white drug users. And so even though these substances are basically the same, although there are arguments that they weren't, which were also racialized, the disparate treatment within the legal system is a form of institutional racism. Now, systemic racism is sort of the third level of analysis or type of racism. This is thinking about institutional racism in interlocking and recursive ways. So we can think of institutional racism in the criminal legal system. We can think of it in the education system. We can think of it in the housing and labor markets. Systemic racism is really trying to understand and think about how these institutions interact and reproduce systems of racial discrimination in ways that maintain hierarchy and entrench racial inequalities. So for example, if we think about discrimination in policing, leading to a greater likelihood of someone who's Black, Latinx, or Indigenous having a criminal record, and then the greater likelihood that they have a criminal record having implications for their ability to obtain a job in the labor market, which then has implications for the types of houses they might get in the housing market or discrimination they may face based on their criminal legal record. In this way, we can see how these forms of inequality reproduce and and further entrench racial inequalities. So I'll stop there, but I look forward to talking about these and other types of questions that you might have about terms as you move forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Claire. That was really helpful. Before we get into questions, and we've already got some really great questions, so keep them coming, we're going to watch a short video by Dr. Jane Willenbring. And she's created a really moving piece for us that talks about how to find your voice as an activist in your institution or in your discipline. So it's about 5 minutes long. And during that time, feel free to pop additional questions into the Q&A. And after the video is over, we'll return to Drs. Claire and Morris and try to get some of your questions answered. Although we probably won't have time for all of them because we're getting a lot of really wonderful ones coming in. Okay, Matt, can you cue up the video, please? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So a couple years before I was born, I guess, John Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice, one of the most important nonfiction books I've ever read, and maybe that's been written. Rawls's view is that just policies, like policies involving justice, should be designed behind an imaginary veil of ignorance. So this veil of ignorance is a sort of thought experiment. Okay, so imagine a university or organization, and they meet together to decide on the rules that govern them. But here's the trick. No one would know what position they had in that organization. So you could be the department chair, you could be the vice provost or undergrad, or you could be the janitor. And so Rawls' argument is that the policies that people would agree on from behind the veil would be just, because people wouldn't make decisions based on self-interest. They would make decisions based on what was fair for everybody, just in case they got, one of the lower positions. And so his big idea was that institutional injustice stems from the rules being written by powerful people who benefit from those rules. That pretty much seems right, doesn't it? So some of you might recognize me as kind of a poster child for sexual harassment in STEM. I hope that's not the case. I have a name, Jane Willenbring. I'm an associate professor of geological sciences at Stanford University. And if you've seen the documentary film, Picture a Scientist, you might remember that the beginning starts out with me talking about how I discovered my why. So what do I mean by that? So for almost 2 decades, I'd been keeping my mouth shut about being sexually harassed and keeping my mouth shut about pretty much everything unjust in academia. Head down, pushing through, doing my work, keeping quiet, trying not to make waves, trying not to think about what I'd experienced. Then my 3-year-old daughter said that she wanted to be a scientist, and that sort of threw me for a loop. Actually, it totally wrecked me. And it became really clear that it wasn't just enough to support women, show them the path that I'd taken, hire them, tell other people to hire them, although those things are good. Felt like I had to do something else, something more structural. I wanted to change the system that allowed someone like him to treat some women like trash for 20 years. So it's weird. I knew my what I should do for a long time, but until my daughter came along, I didn't have what I call my why. And I'm fast forwarding to the summer of 2020, and a cop has his knee on George Floyd's neck while his cop buddies hold him down, murdering him as he calls out for his mom. And I'm thinking about this veil because there was a time when my daughter was in utero when I didn't know if she would be a boy or a girl. I didn't know if she would have brown skin like her dad or look more like me, like a white lady. So now I do a lot of thinking about that. But for a long time, I just thought about justice, and I thought about race. I went to seminars, read a bunch of books, and I kind of like talked the talk. And then in 2020, I feel like I found my why. I feel like I found my purpose. And now it seems like just when I decided that I found my why with regard to helping women in STEM, now I feel like I found my why, and it's not so important exactly what I do, because I know that everything that is a what that I do will be for the benefit of improving justice in STEM. And so while this is a big task, I take heart, and we should all take heart, that we're all here together to create a new organization or reorganization with that veil of ignorance in mind, and that we want to create our organizations with justice in mind. Thank you very much.
All right, so hopefully that video gave you a little bit to think about. And we've got many excellent questions. So I'm going to start with one that's, I think, best answered by Vernon. So get ready, Dr. Morris. Where do you see disconnects between what departments want to do, seeking change, and higher administrative levels, especially in sort of large, cumbersome institutions? And how can change happen at the department level when there's resistance from above? Or how can we ameliorate some of that resistance from above?
Okay. So let me answer the second question first, and I'm going to come back and I may have to ask you to repeat the first question. How do departments make an impact when there's resistance above? So one of the things that most departments have the wherewithal to do is determine your bylaws. You have the wherewithal within a department to develop a strategic plan that you're going, a DEI strategic plan or an equity strategic plan that you're going to enact and enforce. The interviews and the original assessments for P&T, all of that happens at the departmental level. So there's huge power at the departmental level. A number of colleagues of mine, when they say, you go from chair to dean to provost to VPs of various levels, and say, where do you have the most impact that you can make? The chair or the head can make a lot of impact, or has the potential to make a lot of impact on the unit. Now, how much impact that spreads across the institution could be very little, could be minuscule, may only happen in the unit. But if you're talking about is the department empowered to make changes at the department level? Absolutely. Absolutely. The recruitment process for how you find candidates, how you assess candidates, those are happening at unit level. So there's huge power there. And it's unlikely that there's going to be resistance to how you change those types of decisions at any higher level. Admissions decisions, how you support students and faculty who come in to enable their success. All of that can happen within the unit and should happen within the unit, actually. So I hopefully that addresses the second question. Power, as I can roughly define it, is your ability to influence the decisions that you want to have made, period. That's what the power. You can do that at the unit level. Now, if you want to have institutional wide change as a unit, hey, we're, this way, we collaborate with that unit over there, and we want that unit to do the same thing. Okay, that's going to happen up above at the school director level, or at the dean level, or at the provost level, depending on the structure of the university. And that's when alliances up the power hierarchy are absolutely necessary. And sometimes you've got to make those alliances or build those alliances at the board of trustee level. A lot of times we don't talk about things that the faculty senate may have, direct engagement with boards of trustees, or when you don't have faculty senates, faculty unions. But if you can imagine that a board of trustees or a board of regents that influences the institution's mission and direction, values equity, values diversity at the faculty and student levels, it's hard for me to believe that everybody wouldn't get in line. But we never go to them to make pressure. And I think that's, if you want to make sure that things happen throughout the power column, tack the head.
Awesome. No, that was super helpful. And also, one thing I wanted to add was you talked earlier about the importance of departments coming together, right? I think that's another good way to get the attention of the administration, is for there to not just be the geoscience department, but all the, STEM programs or whatever. Thank you. Okay, changing gears a little bit. Another question. I'm interested in the concepts of competition among groups as influencing racism. How do we combat the feeling of competition and loss of scarce resources among groups?
Yeah, that's, I guess that's really directed at me. That's a key and huge problem. It's sort of the fundamental basis, really, of racism was a period of colonialism, slavery, extraction from colonies. And its current justification today is very much, especially as we see sort of the increase of rise of white nationalism in response to immigrant group threat, perceived immigrant group threat, perceptions of economic threat. So I think one way forward, and I've really been inspired by some of the work of scholars such as the book Deaths of Despair, and then also the work on the book Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan, I think his last name is Metzl, who's at Vanderbilt. This work really highlights how it's not just that white or anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism or white supremacy hurts people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people of color, but it also hurts white people in many ways. We see sort of resistance to various forms of trying to build up a modest welfare state in the United States, such as, simply Obamacare as one example. The reactions to that we see among many white people in the Tea Party to begin with, and now sort of white insurrectionists at the Capitol building. This resistance is actually harming many white people as well. And so I think that is part of the analysis, is understanding how racism is bad for everyone, is one way, but then also really having conversations about how we make sure that we help everyone while we're also helping those who are most marginalized by systems of oppression.
Wonderful, thank you so much. We've got so many good questions, it's really hard to pick. So I'm going to go with one. Dr. Clare's article discusses the origin of racism as deriving from taxonomy and justified by social Darwinism, etc. What implications do you think this has for us as natural scientists? In other words, some of the most fundamental concepts we rely upon in the natural sciences in general have been used to support racism. How do we reckon with this?
I can take a quick stab too at this one. I think that's a really great point, and something to really think about within the natural sciences. I will say the social sciences, unfortunately, are also, there's work on sort of just various sort of epigenetic work that's sort of fused and is sort of infusing into the social sciences. And, there are people who are starting to theorize, how should we think about negative implications of this work? How do we think about its relationship to various forms of oppression that we've seen historically and we know this can lead to, such as Nazism or social Darwinism as well, which sort of wanted this kind of data and work. And then also, how should we think about sort of markers or genetic markers as really indicative of already existing inequalities, not necessarily sort of the cause, right, but really sort of the outcome in many ways. Is one way I know some social scientists, this is not at all my expertise, but I know some social scientists have been trying to think about this increasing sort of wedding of the natural sciences and social science with respect to genetic research.
Wonderful, thank you.
If I could just quickly
Of course.
add onto that, I think, you can always weaponize partial information. And I think one of our responsibilities as scientists, be it natural scientists or physical scientists or social scientists, behavioral scientists, is being aware of the history of weaponizing information and knowledge, especially in the technical arena. And that privilege and that power has been used to detriment for a lot of the time. But our voices should be used to make sure that the current understanding is that there is no scientific basis for race. It does not exist. It's like witchcraft or racecraft, as one of the books says. And let's expose that. But you have at the same time popular imagination or what have you to say that these things have value. And ultimately, when people believe something has value, it has value. But that's one of the responsibilities, I think, for scientists of color and allies of scientists of color to be very vocal and upfront about when something is simply being used as subterfuge or distraction with scientific terms versus science. There is no science in race, period. And we need to say that and be clear about that. And I think geosciences has some problems that the natural sciences don't have. I think Matthew talked about that in terms of being highly extractive in its development. We go in and we want the natural resources. And so if a person is there, we have to dehumanize them because we need them out of the way so we can get those resources. And we have to be cognizant of the history of the development of science, where these things have then said, because we're looking for resources and we're commodifying the earth system, we ultimately have to commodify people so that power can be maintained by a technical advantage. Understanding the history is really important. It's one thing I didn't understand earlier. Science is science. I'm just going to get these facts. I'm going to be good. The history of how you got those facts and understood those things really dictates how they're used. And so you have to be cognizant of history. As a scientist, you must be cognizant of history as well.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. That was really, really powerful and really resonated. The next one is, I think, potentially for both of you, especially Matthew in your position as a pre-tenure faculty member. How can one, as an early career faculty member who is non-white, juggle tenure track ladder as well as service, working with students and faculty and administration to achieve diversity goals? Should I now be or feel compelled to sit on diversity committees, being one of the few non-white faculty members?
Should I? Yeah, I'll go first, and then I think Dr. Morris should give me the corrective. I should be. I can say how I'm working on that and behaving, and then Dr. Morris will fill in what I should be doing. So, so descriptively, what I am doing, I'm doing things like this, having conversations like this. I'm doing it within Stanford, obviously, within my department as well. I will say there have been times when I've been asked to be on like search committees or things like that, where luckily there is another Black faculty member in my department who's senior who can do that. And so we've really had conversations, sort of back-end conversations, about some things. And so I think that's important for faculty of color. If you have a mentor in the department, to really hope that they are senior and they can sort of take a lot of the burden. But if not, if you're the only one, there are things that I've decided to do that I think are just important and that are meaningful and that will hopefully be able to help people. But what I tend to do is try to make sure there's some type of either recognition that will be sort of made plain at the tenure moment, or some material compensation for my time and my efforts. And I think increasingly that's becoming known that should be a thing. So it actually hasn't been as hard as I've been told that it might be when I first started as a junior faculty member 2 years ago. And so that's sort of what I do. But Dr. Morris, tell me what I should be doing. Tell me what we should be doing.
Thanks for that lead-in. when I get or hear questions like this, my typical answer is that this is not a you problem and it's not an us problem, it's a we problem. There's no reason for the only people to be asked for these duties, for these committees, or the first people even, to be the faculty of color. And as a departmental leader or a unit leader, that has to be an equalized burden. You know, if we have allies, those allies should be stepping up to say, look, we'll take this. And not take it as I'll lead this and I'll be the voice of everything, but we're going to have an equal load in this. And there'll be some committees you just got to say, and your leadership should say, Matthew, no, you don't have time for this right now, because we need you here 10 years from now, right? And that's, you have a limited amount of bandwidth. You've got to pick and choose what you put into that bandwidth, and then that is going to breathe sometimes. Sometimes you're going to be doing a little bit more, and sometimes a little bit less, depending on what the milestones are and what you're trying to do personally. So I think that more people, short answer, more people need to be involved and must be involved. Leadership does have to value it and resource it, but they also have to protect junior faculty in particular. And a lot of that work needs to be done by the senior most faculty, who are members of the National Academy, for example, who have a lot of weight on the faculty senate. And in just when they voice their opinion, people hear it across the university. Those are the people who need to be on the DEI committee saying, this is really important. This is what I value. This is what everyone should value. Because frankly speaking, their voice is way more than any junior faculty's voice. All right? They've been installed at that university. They're going to have the gravitas to make sure that these changes are longstanding when they commit. What's been the failure a lot of times, they don't commit. They sit back, wait for someone else to do the work. Right? They're not talking to the president or their friends on the board of trustees. I'm gonna keep banging on the board of trustees and the board of regents, because the folks who talk with them a lot can make the changes that we need. They need to become true allies in this we problem. Because if the only people who are working on it, it becomes essentialized to those people working. It's those people, it's them over there. It's that junior faculty, Matthew. He needs to get this. If he can, make this work, it'll be great for us. No, that's not the way to think about it. And so as a unit leader, I try to get heavy involvement by the most senior faculty that I have.
Thank you so much. So all the senior faculty and chairs listening to this right now, you've got your mission now. And I hope you've taken Dr. Morris's words to heart. The next question, I think, is back in Matthew's court, which is a couple of questions about the idea of colorblindness as being a form of racism. And this is something that I think many of us encounter with white colleagues. So sort of talking a little bit more about that concept and how we might go around about counteracting that instinct to say, oh, well, I don't see color.
Yeah, so colorblind racism, the term itself is from Eduardo Bonilla Silva's work. Racism Without Racists is the title of his book, but he's also written several articles about colorblind racism, and there's actually been a profusion of literature on colorblind racism. But it's also similarly related to other forms of new racisms that are cultural justifications or logics or ideas that are used in order to justify existing racial inequalities. There are various facets of colorblind racism in Bonilla Silva's articulation. There's also laissez-faire racism, which Larry Bobo developed, which really has a structural critique of colorblind racism, suggesting that these logics are rooted in a desire to maintain racial hierarchies and political economic advantages among white people. So it's not just an actual sort of ignorant, innocence, it's really a willful ignorance and sort of undergirding realization that these inequalities by race are actually not, things that should exist. And so, there are various types and scripts and ways that this work, but they tend to be sort of cultural justifications for inequality between people of color and white people. Was there a second part of that question about how we can deal with colorblind racism? I think I lost.
Yeah, or maybe, if you're having a conversation in your pod, let's say with a colleague who brings this up, what are some ways that you can maybe point that person in a different direction?
Yeah. It's difficult, but I think sort of at the individual level, I think unmasking how race group differences are manufactured and socially constructed. So for example, we could think about, I'll just use the case that I'm most familiar with, we could think about in the criminal legal system. So a colorblind racist ideology or approach would suggest that, Black people are arrested more often than white people because of some cultural difference, such as engaging in different likelihood of engaging in different sort of forms of criminalized behavior. And so in order to unmask that, you really have to have a structural critique and analysis of the ways that group differences in perceived criminalized behaviors exist, but then also talk about top-down forms of racial discrimination with respect to policing, the way police shift resources to certain communities and not to others, and how there are negative forms of resources and positive forms of resources in policing. So really it requires a sort of an analysis and a willingness to engage with the different structural and social forces that might be racist, that lead to these race group differences, not blaming or focusing on sort of what exists sort of biologically within the person or culturally within a group, and that leads to these differences. So really highlighting the structural forms of racial discrimination that bring about these differences in order to make it so that we can see that we are not a colorblind society, if you will.
Awesome, thank you so much. So I think this next question is going to be our last one because we want to have a few minutes at the end to talk about some of the logistics for the week. And we've gotten a number of questions that are related, so I'm going to kind of summarize them a little bit. Essentially, the question is, how do you respond to folks, especially those in power, who believe there is nothing wrong or nothing to fix? So how do you convince them that the experiences of Black and Indigenous and people of color in their departments are real, that there are real problems, and that often it's the senior faculty who are less willing or able to understand systemic racism than junior faculty or graduate students. So, there's a couple of things going on here. There's the power dynamics between those who maybe are on board and those who are not. And then how do you basically convince someone of the reality of a problem without, parading people's pain?
I can take a stab first, and I think it would be great for Dr. Morris to actually finish us off. So, I'll say I think one way to do this is to have a linguistic shift away from inequality or things being unequal to things being unjust, or there being injustice, or there being a lack of equity. And so that shift really places an analysis and an invitation for people to really have a conversation, not just about sort of what are group differences, but why are they there? So how did they come about? And then also, could they be remedied? So really a focus on shifting from inequality to injustice. Injustice is a difference that could be remedied if our society operated differently, if we made social structures differently. Whereas an inequality could exist, such as between people based on height, that can't be remedied necessarily by a change in social structure, right? But inequalities based on race certainly can, because there are no biological differences between racial groups who are characterized by random phenotypical differences, right? And so having that kind of shift in what the problem is or the problem diagnosis could really lead to, I think, a more fruitful conversation about ways to convince people that, oh yeah, the lack of Black or Indigenous faculty in this department is not something that would exist unless there were some form of injustice bringing that about, either historically or contemporarily.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great perspective, is to interrogate the question that's being asked. Because if you do that, one, you can be clear, both parties can be clear on what you're actually talking about. A lot of times when you just sort of respond to perceived bias or prejudice or resistance to change, you're not communicating with that person where they are. And so one of the things that I found has been helpful is just trying to figure out how to have a conversation where both parties are actually listening to each other. And that's nuanced, and that's going to be situationally dependent. But once you can get to a place where you're actually listening to each other, and I think by changing the question, changing the focus away from something that can't be changed to something that can be changed is really important. But also trying to get people to stop being defensive about what they're going to lose, right? Because if you're, two things that no one really listens once they see it coming is a threat to one's goodness. You're a racist, no one's listening anymore. Or you're going to lose out in this equation, try to get some money for, no more listening. So you've got to shift the question where you're in a space where you can communicate without the defensiveness. And I think this is where sometimes having more diverse leadership can help, because that power dynamic that often happens when a Black person is trying to speak in the academy is like this. That doesn't work a whole lot of times. But if you're communicating, it's always like this. And of course, if you've got a position of power, sometimes it's like that, and that doesn't hurt at any point in time. I think the other thing is you got a couple of different strategies for people. Some people need to see the value proposition, right? They got to see, what is the value in this change that you're talking about? What is the value in this conversation that we're having? What is the value in understanding this problem as it's framed? And so getting people to value other people is very important, because I think a lot of if you can change the conversation to that, a lot more people listen. I find when I share and get more intimate with the problem at my level as a leader, if I talk from the leadership perspective and say, I actually understand what students are going through, and this is why. I resonate with George Floyd getting killed because he doesn't look too much different than me. I've been where he's been. And as a academic leader saying that to other deans and provosts, people start to say, oh, okay, whoa. And it's different from the new hire who just came in, or it's different from the grad student who's saying, we need to organize and change this. This is not right. And so you have to get people to listen. And sometimes that means becoming a little more vulnerable than the typical academic leader tends to be. And that's difficult, I think, a lot for academic leaders of color, because you've got to put on your armor when you go out every day, to stay in your position. Did I get this position because I'm Black, or did I get this position because, I'm good, or what? And I think, again, speaking from my personal vantage point, you've got to take the armor off and try to communicate with people, because that's going to help get the communication going, get the listening going, and then ultimately change can happen at that point in time. So it's nuanced, I think, but you've got to, open up a little bit more than we typically see leadership opening up.
Well, thank you so much. That was a really wonderful way to end, with a note on the power of being vulnerable. And I just want to say thank you so much to both Dr. Morris and Dr. Clare for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. We really, really appreciate it. And there's been so many amazing questions that we didn't get time to answer. So you'll probably both be getting emails from folks after this. So I'm going to turn it back over to Vishan, who's going to talk a little bit about logistics. We realize that some of you may need to go since we're at the half hour. And so thank you all for being here. And don't sign off just yet. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Phoebe, and thank you, Matt and Vernon, for a great conversation. And thank you for everybody who joined us. I'm just going to go quickly through some logistics. It's been overwhelming. There's been a lot of interest in URGE, and we want to thank everybody truly from the bottom of our hearts. And we want you guys to keep joining us week after week on this journey towards becoming more anti-racist. We want to thank the National Science Foundation for funding this project. So we're working our way through some of the pods and putting them on our website. We have over 300 pods that signed up, and we're working our way through putting everything on the website, and so you can see yourselves and your pods represented on our maybe a couple of days from that. I'd like to remind the pod leaders to remember to have, and pod members to remember to have your scheduled individual group discussion meetings this week, as well as to talk about the deliverables. This week, the one that's due on Friday is, that agreement between your group members on to really how you're going to communicate with each other, how you're going to assign your deliverables, how you're going to create it, how you're going to lead, how you're going to talk to each other, etc. So that one's due on Friday. And we want to encourage you to continue working on, and some of you might be done already, getting the agreement between your institution, organizational leadership, and your pods, which will be due by the end of the second session. And the final thing that I'd like to say is the second session, which is begins next Monday. That one is on racism and individuals, where after we now know what the definitions of racism, the definition of racism is, or the various types of racism, we need to know where do we fit inside of that paradigm, and where do we fit inside the words racism. And the way the curriculum is designed is that we need to know what it is. Then we need to know where we fit inside the words. And then we need to look back at the history, as Vernon said, and understand how we got to where we got. And so next week we'll have two wonderful women, one focused on really on white privilege and racism and what it means, as well as a paper focused on a student experience in STEM disciplines and racism. And so we look forward to you guys joining us. We'll try to answer as much of the questions as possible. We update our facts very frequently, and so we'll do that. We'll follow up with questions, and we'll follow up with more instructions. And that's it from us at URGE. And I want to end by saying something that Ayanna Presley said. Ayanna said, policy is our love language. So please focus on using the data and information and the readings and the conversations to design policies that will cause or lead to real change in our discipline. Thank you, guys. We really appreciate you.